how absolutely relevant this would become, and I think in particular, in many ways for the youth movements themselves. Which youth movements do we have represented here? Okay, so we've got a broad enough range. We have a broad enough range that this should be an exciting session, or a controversial one perhaps. And when I was first asked the question, IT person, it's not moving, it's a Mac. What does that mean? It worked before. There we go. Left and right. Okay.
That's not a political session.
All right. I'll go back and forth. I'm going to remain neutral.
Yeah.
So I was asked the question, could we criticize Israel and still be good Zionists? And my immediate reaction, we'll see if I'm going right or left here. Whoops. Wrong way. Is, can we be good Zionists and not criticize Israel? And the context that I was asking that in was actually not in the context of the war, but more in terms of thinking about what we set out to do in Israel, what we want, what we dreamed that it would become, where we are at today, and the gap between that vision, that dream that we have, the chazon, and current day realities. Of course, we all, I'm sure, feel great pride and wonder. We're in wonder about all of Israel's achievements, but we also know that we are have not yet done what we've set out to do. And I refer back to Theodor Herzl, already at the early Zionist congresses. He said, those of us who today are prepared to hazard our lives for the cause would regret having raised a finger if we were able to organize only a new social system and not a more righteous one. Herzl, of course, had a dream not just of creating a safe place for Jews to live in, something which, depending on the month, we more or less have. We're, of course, under danger now and under threat, but we have that place to live in. But he also had this vision of creating really a chevrat mofet, an exemplary society. And we won't delve into that today, but regardless of what the vision is that each of you has as a member of the various youth movements that you're a part of, whatever that vision of what Israel should become, we all know we have a lot more to work for. But the context has completely changed now, and I don't want to ignore that. And we're now in a situation where we have very different kind of criticism that we are facing. This is already outdated. It says Turkey's prime minister, he's since become the president, and making statements, if you support this cruelty, this genocide, this Hitler-like fascism and child murderer regime, take your award back. That was in response. The American Jewish Committee had given him an award a few years ago for, I don't know what it was actually for, even when they gave it to him, and they're threatening to take it back now. He says, who needs it? What is the difference between Israeli actions and those of the Nazis and Hitler? How can you explain what the Israeli state has been doing in Gaza, if not genocide, and so on and so forth? This kind of criticism, obviously, the way we respond to it, we're not going to change his mind or those of his ilk and those who think like that. We can't ignore these kinds of things because the rest of the world does hear them, and if people don't stand up to them, it's going to just be assumed that what he's saying is the case, and we're not after changing the minds of those who think like this, but those who might be influenced by it. But that's kind of off the map. That's not the kind of criticism that I'm most concerned with in the community. There's another kind of criticism. This appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald just a couple of weeks ago. Have you seen this? Are you familiar with this? Okay. So I just point out you have a caricature of a Jew here that could have been taken out of Nazi propaganda with a kippah, a big hooked nose, this Jewish star on the back. A cat sitting very peacefully. Notice the cat just sitting very peacefully in a cup of coffee, and he's just nonchalantly blowing up buildings there. To me, there's something fascinating about this cartoon, and something that I think all of us have to become very aware of. What stands out for you in this cartoon besides its obvious anti-Semitic, I won't even say overtones, it's blatant anti-Semitism. What message do you get from this? Yes?
I can't see any rockets. There's no reason. He is the cause. His remote control is the cause.
Okay, very interesting. Remote control is the cause. Anything else that stands out for you?
This ambiguity between Israel and Jews.
Excellent. Okay. To me, this epitomizes more than any other cartoon or article, just very succinctly, exactly that. This is a war that has blurred the lines, has blurred the line between the front line and the rear, in a sense, both in Israel itself, where the whole country really has come under attack, almost the whole country, but even more so between Israel and Jewish communities around the world. It's very interesting. When the Sydney Morning Herald issued an apology for this cartoon, they wrote, "Don't you think," whoops, that was, wrong one. I don't have it in there, but I do have it. I'll tell you what it said, more or less. We'll go back. In their retraction, they apologized for presenting something that didn't distinguish between Judaism, the religion, and the national element. In other words, if they had portrayed this as an Israeli with a kovat temple instead of a kippah, and an Israeli flag instead of a Jewish star on the back, they wouldn't have apologized. And then your comment about there's no rockets, it looks like just he's doing it. They don't have any problem conveying that message, but they did apologize for casting aspersions on the entire Jewish people. But the fact that it got through initially, to me, is an indication that in the world's mind already, there is no distinction, which in some ways is kind of a victory for Zionism. We set out to create a Jewish state that belonged to the entire Jewish people, but now Jews around the world, whether they like it or not, we're all in this together. And that's something that's really come out of this war. And there are people within the Jewish community who are distancing themselves from that to some extent. And others who find themselves caught up in a situation that they just absolutely didn't expect. Yes?
It's actually older than this war. I mean, the idea that people are putting pressure on Israel to go back to the pre-67 borders, they've been doing this for a while, because you've stolen this land from those people and you're not giving it back. Let's forget about whether that's correct or not. Those same people could be in the United States and aren't ready to give back the land to the Native Americans. They could be in Australia and they aren't ready to give back the land to the Aboriginals. But somehow, if it's Israel has to be giving back to the West Bank and Gaza.
Right, but I'm not talking about that criticism of Israel. That's been around, as you said, for a long time. I'm talking about this is now the responsibility of the whole Jewish people. And that really hasn't come out before to the extent that it is now, and it's also manifested in the incredible spike of anti-Semitism, of violent anti-Semitism sometimes, in places around the world. Last Shabbat I was in a synagogue in Cape Town, and just 300 meters away, literally, was a demonstration. It was estimated, some estimates were 30,000, another estimate up to 100,000 of Muslims demonstrating in the street against what Israel is doing. And I don't have it with me now, but the community liaison officer, a government-appointed official who was very involved amazingly in organizing this march, on his Facebook page wrote, "I dare you Jews to come out into the street and protest. I promise you a bloodbath." It wasn't you Israelis. It was, again, the Jews. The whole Jewish people has somehow now is being given has to take responsibility or has accountability for Israel's actions, which is the whole issue, which we'll get into as well. In the meantime, however, it's neither Erdogan's criticism or this which concerns me the most. Which concerns to me, and which I think we have to deal with most directly, particularly in the situations you're in, is a different kind of criticism. This comes from an email from my cousin Hal. I wrote Bob to protect the innocent or the guilty or whatever. I had written an article at the outbreak of this war called "It's Not the Settlement, Stupid." That was what I called the article, and I explained where it came from. And my cousin, who's a professor of education at Queens College in New York, an intelligent person, he's also 80 years old. He's still teaching. He's 80 years old, so it's not like representing a new generation like yourselves that might be considered more critical and so on. But he wrote, "Don't you think that Hamas proclamations that they want to destroy Israel and throw the Jews into the sea might just be rhetorical flourishes?" That's what he used, the term, rhetorical flourishes. They don't really mean it. They're just saying it for public consumption. Then he went on, "Actually, I have the impression that Israel's leaders even relish these statements because they can be used to justify any and all actions." So I wrote back, "Hal, 12,000 rockets having been fired at Israel since 2005 when we withdrew unilaterally, asking only for peace in return, cannot be dismissed as rhetorical flourishes. Those rockets are meant to kill. 30 tunnels, more than 30 tunnels, attack tunnels that we've discovered underground that had absolutely no other purpose other than to be able to bring terrorists into Israel to destroy, to murder our innocent civilians, cannot be dismissed as rhetorical flourishes." And at the same time that he doesn't take what Hamas is saying as to accept it at face value, he also doesn't accept what Israel's leaders are saying at face value, that they really didn't want this war, that there was restraint, that they grabbed onto any opportunity that there was for a ceasefire, and so on. And he's turned it, he's in his own mind is doing, he can't accept the reality the way it's being presented to him, because for him it's so foreign, and I think for many critics, what Hamas really stands for, and the whole idea of civilian shields, and we'll get into, or we won't get into, how many civilian casualties and what might have been done to prevent it, but we can't get away from the reality that Hamas really did set up its rocket launches and store its munitions in places where civilians were, with the full knowledge that it was going to bring about civilian casualties. But it's so far from the way a Western liberal mind thinks that they just can't believe it's the case. And it's this kind of criticism, I think, that we have to take very seriously and can't dismiss the kinds of questions that come up from others. And I imagine there's also criticism of Israel from within this room. We have to be very careful, as far as I'm concerned, about dismissing it. Are you all familiar? You heard also Michael Gillis refer to it. The deputy head boy at King David College in Johannesburg, who's also the head of the national, not the Jewish, the national South African debating team, was at a international debating competition in Thailand, and he and the other two members of the national team, who also happened to be Jewish, photographed themselves on and posted it on Facebook wearing keffiyeh, and writing that they were doing so as an indication of sympathy with the Palestinians who were dying. Here's a bit of a close-up. Josh Bloomberg, who was the young man involved in this, apologized for his saying his comments were not meant to offend anybody. "While I apologize for the hurt we seem to have caused," he writes, "I do not apologize for standing with Palestine on this issue. We stand with the thousands of civilians who have lost their lives in the conflict. We stand with the people who do not yet have a state to protect themselves. We stand with the innocents We stand for two states. We do not stand against Israel. All of this applies to me personally as well, he wrote. And interestingly, we have, I think it was 11 prior head boys and head girls of the school wrote a letter supporting his right to have done what he did. We believe that silencing people, especially young people, is not in the spirit of our community. Freedom of conscience and freedom of expression are values we treasure. We call for the attacks on Josh to stop. So that's a whole other piece of criticism that is out there. At the same time, I've got the paper here, also on that. This, by the way, was front page, not only front page news, but the top headline of a regular, the most widely read general newspaper in Johannesburg. It wasn't it's not part of the Jewish press. It's fascinating, and this, I think, brings us back to my earlier comments, that the entire Jewish community is being associated with what's going on in Israel. And the paper, with glee, writes as well, local Jews denounce blind support for Israel, and feature here an article in the paper the day before. This is from Monday. On the Sunday preceding, 500 prominent Jews from South Africa had taken out an ad in the same paper, or I think in another paper actually, also expressing their concern with the plight of the Palestinians. They write, "We are proudly Jewish. We know that every human being is invested with inherent dignity, every life equal. Just as we resist anti-Semitism, we refuse to dehumanize Palestinians in order to make their deaths lighter, or our collective conscience, or to make their deaths lighter on our collective conscience. We sign this statement in order to affirm their humanity and our own." I don't know to what extent these kinds of things are coming out in Australia, but I'm sure that they're there, if not as publicly. I don't think Josh, when he took the picture of himself and posted it on Facebook, realized that he was literally going to be the top headline in the newspaper. But I'm sure on one level or another, these kinds of issues are there. And therefore, I think we have to ask ourselves the question of what, in this context and going forward, what is responsible criticism, how we respond to different criticism, and how we judge it for ourselves, and what we say to those who are expressing criticism of Israel. And I'm suggesting here the ABCs and 3Ds of assessing criticism. The first letter here, A, is for me affirmation. The criticism of Israel, if it's going to be responsible, if it's going to be considered within the fold, if we're able to respond to it intelligently, it has to come out of an affirmation for Israel's right to exist. It's very, very different. You can say the same thing about Israel as a way of undermining Israel's right to exist, and it's something very different if you say it out of an affirmation of that right to exist. So to me, that's the first critical element. B, I would suggest, is for balance. Again, what we say, sometimes the balance or lack of it is very subtle. I was listening to President Obama answer questions at a press conference just a few days ago. And he talked about the need to arrive at a lasting cessation of the violence, of the conflict, both to assure that the innocent Palestinians in Gaza who are being killed will no longer have to suffer, and so that Israel will have a right or be able to defend itself. What's unbalanced about that statement? I don't think he meant any imbalance there at all. Anybody pick up on anything?
Only the Palestinians are innocent.
Well, the Palestinians are innocent, but not only that, the Palestinians are suffering, and who is? People, right? He talked about the innocent Palestinian civilians and the right of Israel to defend itself. And again, I don't think, it wasn't scripted.
Sorry. Don't you think he was making a distinction, not that all the Palestinians are innocent and therefore the Israelis are guilty, but differentiating between those Hamasnikim and civilian Palestinians?
Not in the context of what he was saying. I think he was projecting a message unintentionally that there's people on one side of the border and this political entity on the other. And again, I know he knows there's people live in Israel, and he knows the people are traumatized by the rockets, and I'm sure it wasn't intentional, but anybody listening to it subtly, it's much easier to identify with people who are suffering than it is to a machine that's defending itself. So the balance is, and maybe it wasn't, but that's the way I interpret it. In any case, it serves as an example of the way that there sometimes can be a lack of balance, even among those who don't intend it. And I mention this also because I think all four of these things that I'm going to suggest for you are things that we can demand in a way of our own people, even in their criticism of Israel. The third thing is context. To talk about the death of 2,000 innocent Palestinians and 400 and some odd children, as horrendous as that is, and as much regret as we might feel about it, to only highlight that without talking about the context in which the entire operation began is also unfair. I mean, at this point, I don't think anybody in the world knows, or if they know, remembers or thinks about it in the context of the abduction of the 3 young Israelis who were brutally, cold-blooded murdered, which really set off this latest round of violence. To not offer the context in which something has evolved is also unfair. The fourth letter here, I said the ABCs, so I get another C here. Constructive. There's a difference between saying things, I'll just finish the sentence and then get back to it. There's a difference between saying something for the sake of bashing Israel and trying to create public opinion against Israel, and saying something out of a desire to reach some kind of constructive solution or to get people to think about things positively. Before I go on, you wanted to say something.
Included in context, you have to include, just as if you've got a guy who's holding a human shield and shooting at you, and you shoot back, and you accidentally hit the shield, who murdered that kid? The guy holding the shield, not the guy who shot him. At the same token, the Palestinians, by having their missile launchers right in front of schools, etc., and then you have to take out that missile launcher.
We know, I'm sure that everybody in this room knows that kind of argument, and if we were having a debate, we would raise those kinds of things. But what I'm looking here are ways of critiquing criticism that comes about within your movements, between yourselves and those who might not be in your movements and so on. Because these are things, as I started to say, we can ask for this. We can go back to Josh Broomberg, who took this picture, and ask him in his criticism to, and I'm just using him as an example, is what you are saying coming out of an affirmation of Israel's right to exist? He did say in his statement, yes, he said that. Are you offering a balanced picture? We won't go into Josh in particular, but these are things that we can ask, first of all, of ourselves, and second of all, those with whom we are interacting and engaging. We have a right to demand all of these things in having a meaningful conversation about Israel, not only about what's going on in Gaza now, but in general. And these things, as far as I'm concerned, are far too often missing from the discourse. And it's our collective responsibility in a way to ensure as much as possible that these things are there. When we are answering letters to the editor in newspapers, Facebook messages, and so on and so forth, we can point these things out to people. And again, we're not going to convince those who are already convinced, who will say, don't confuse me with the facts, I already have my position. But for the vast majority, I believe, of the world that's out there that might be listening, if we add these things to the conversation, I think we'll have a better chance of presenting our case. There are also 3 Ds here, which I can't take credit for. Those belong to Natan Sharansky. He wrote an article a few years ago about how one distinguishes between blatant anti-Semitism and constructive criticism. And he said there are 3 things that are unacceptable to him. The first is demonization. And here, if we go back to the statement that I showed you from Erdogan about calling us Nazis and genocide and Hitler, continuing Hitler in Hitler's tradition and so on, all of those things are clearly meant to demonize Israel. Those terms, and I'll add apartheid to it as well, are so far from any reality that to use them in the context of what Israel is doing is simply meant to demonize us. With whatever discrimination there might be or prejudice there might be in regard to Arabs in Israel, with whatever lack of equal distribution of resources to the Arab community, and there's plenty to criticize Israel for about as far as I'm concerned, in terms of its treatment of the Arab minorities. It is such a distance between that and anything that resembles apartheid that to use the word is there really only to demonize. And actually, having just spent a few days in South Africa, I find it fascinating that they really invented, they're the ones who started the campaign about Israel as an apartheid state. And for me, I actually managed to get away from the Jewish community for a couple of hours and got up to the Constitution Hill. I don't know if any of you have been there, where the famous prison was, where Mandela and others were in prison, and really got a taste of what apartheid was and what it meant. When somebody else talks about something going on in the world as a Holocaust, what's our reaction? What do we say?
What right do you have to say?
Absolutely. What right do you have to say that's us? The Holocaust was us. Anything else that's happening is so minimal in comparison to what the Holocaust really was. By using the phrase to talk about what's happening elsewhere, you're cheapening it, and you're undermining the moral claim that we have as a result of the Holocaust. Interestingly, those who went through apartheid, who suffered from it, don't feel that kind of a threat. And that's a whole other issue. I don't know why it's there. But use of that kind of terminology is clearly a process of demonization of Israel. The other thing here is double standards. Again, to a certain extent, it's our fault as well. For thousands of years, we've been telling people we're the chosen people, we're a light unto the nations, right from the command first given to Abraham to go to the land that I will show you, to leave your home and your father's house and the country where you were born, to the land that I will show you. There I will make of you a great people. And what's the rest of the pasuk? And through you, the nations of the world will be blessed. Okay? And we've been hammering away at that for thousands of years, that we're going to be the shining example for the rest of the world. We have that extra responsibility. We take it seriously. Tikkun olam is a watchword of our faith and of our action. And we've applied, in a sense, a double standard to ourselves, and that we're proud of. We don't like it, and legitimately, we don't like it when others apply it to us, apply it to the situation. And of course, it really has no place in political discourse and so on, in terms of commissions of inquiry that are set up, in terms of putting people on trial for war crimes. and so on and so forth. There's no room for double standards, and yet they're often applied. And here too, those double standards are sometimes very subtle. Sometimes they're blatant and they're easy to deal with. Other times they're subtle. Again, it was on CNN, I think on Friday, when last Friday, when the United States started bombing ISIS targets, and there was a reporter, excuse me, on CNN who talked about the ISIS terrorists, and almost in the same breath they talked about the Hamas militants, okay? The ISIS fighters are terrorists. The ones we're dealing with are militants. Huge difference in connotation, and again, a different standard being applied. The third is delegitimization, and this really brings us back to the first letter A for affirmation. If you're going to delegitimize the very right of a Jewish state to exist, it becomes just unacceptable. It's impossible to engage in conversation with that. There's some 21 Arab states. The number of states that have come into being since the end of World War II, particularly throughout Europe, is amazing. And with whatever is going on in other countries around the world, everything that's going on in Syria, even if people were to criticize it as much as we would like and to see it in the news as much as Israel is in the news, they talk about regime change in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, whatever, but nobody talks about taking away the right of that country to exist. And that already, as far as I'm concerned, is a non-starter. Anybody that's going to demonize, apply double standards, or delegitimize the right of the state to exist is already a whole different level of exchange, and that has to be pointed out to them as well. Yes?
But how do you deal then with that kind of people? Those who hold those positions and those who are criticised both within and from outside. It's easy to deal with the ones who take the Yesod Hanacha, Medinat Israel, LaYehudim, but they're not the issue. Those are the issues. How do we deal with them?
Okay, so again, depending on the context in which you're doing it, it's very different if you're writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper in response to an article that's been written, or if you're in a one-to-one conversation, or if you're in an interfaith group trying to work things out. But here, I think, again, you're only trying to convince those who are prepared to listen. And to take words like genocide, to take words like Holocaust, to take words like apartheid, Nazism, and so on, can easily be disproven. And there's plenty of information out there, and I'm going to give you a little sample of it, and along with a list of annotated websites. The information is there. What I'm suggesting, without going into the deep, I mean, we can talk about how can you talk about an apartheid state when Israel has 15 members, Arab members of Knesset, and the Declaration of Independence declares that it has full and equal rights, even if we don't fulfill all of those things exactly. It's written in the Constitution. In apartheid, it was exactly the opposite. The blacks were specifically deprived of their rights, and so on and so forth. So you really can go through these things and say, look, you're demonizing Israel. What I'm suggesting here with these words is to point those things out to thinking people. Because thinking people, like my cousin Hal, I sent him excerpts from the Hamas charter. He had never seen it. He said, there's a quote there that the day of judgment, on the day of judgment, when it comes, the Jews who will be hiding behind the trees and the rocks, and the trees and the rocks will come forth and say, in the name of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. Okay? Like, he was flabbergasted that an organization could actually write those kinds of things. He could still debate with me whether they meant it literally or not. But he just wasn't aware of those kinds of things. So for people who are open to discussion, you can point out, look, you're demonizing Israel by the application of these terms which have no basis in fact whatsoever. You're applying double standards. Look, you call them terrorists and ours militants. What's the difference between them? You can say, on what basis are you questioning Israel's right to exist? Give one other example in the world where somebody is suggesting that a country be dismantled. It doesn't happen. And so on a cerebral level, I think you're really able to get to them. Back to the first A, B, and C. Also, you can argue with somebody, are you affirming Israel's right to exist? Are you providing a balanced picture of it? And so the purpose of this session isn't going to the precise details, but to sensitize us to the kinds of things that we can point out to those who would Israel's detractors.
I just want to ask a question about the previous slide, if you can go back. So when we, as a Jewish community, criticise the Palestinians, there's also a debate of how we should do that, and that's also raised in the media. Do you think we should also follow those three rules in the way we criticise Palestinians?
Great question. I haven't thought about it, but the answer is yes.
So how would you do
what that means in practice, but I've got to stick to the principles, and I would have to do the same thing. How would I do that? I would certainly, in this case, again, you have me thinking on my feet, which is good. I would personally, and I think I can easily say this, it's the official government position, I affirm the right of the Palestinians to a state of their own. Okay?
If you don't agree with a two-state solution, does that mean you can't criticise Palestinians?
If you don't agree with the two-state solution, what was the next of that?
Can you still criticise, because you're not doing the aid?
I think at the very minimum, you have to affirm the right of the Palestinian people to self-expression, and I would say self-determination. If you can't affirm their right to self-determination in a negotiated, I'm not suggesting how far right or left you have to be, but I do think if you deny that the Palestinians exist because before 1967 no one called himself a Palestinian, they're not going to. You can't argue with them. You can't argue with them. And I think all of these things would apply. I would have to work that through in terms of what it would actually meant in discussing it. But I think here, again, with the thing of double standards, if we're not able to make such statements and deal with the conflict in the same way for them, and also without demonizing them, which is very hard for us with Hamas being what it is, but it would require of us things which we don't get in return so much, which is to say that not all Palestinians believe in that. I know somebody say, show me one or two or three, and there are. They're not as outspoken, and we don't have as many liberal, outspoken Palestinians by any means that we do as we have in Israel and among the Jewish community. There are already demonstrations going on in Israel among Israelis against the war and so on and so forth, and you don't have any demonstration in Gaza or in the West Bank protesting the fact that Hamas is using Palestinian children as human shields.
It's because they get shot if they do.
Right, it's very possible that they'd get shot if they do, and it's very possible that there aren't enough to bring together in a demonstration. I don't know. So it's very hard for us, for me even, to say yes about all of those things because I don't feel that responsiveness on the other side. But yes, if I were talking with my cousin Hal, I would have to find ways to do this. Yes. Yeah.
How do you answer people who question Israel's right to exist based on a religion? There are people who say, well, you can't base a country on a particular religion.
Okay, and I would say that we were a people, at least pretty much as long as we've been a religion, and back in the time when we became one or the other, the two were completely intertwined. But it was Bnei Yisrael, it was the children of Israel who left Mitzrayim. And we've seen ourselves really as a people throughout. And when it's a particularly pertinent question now as we're during these few weeks standing with Moshe on the other side of the Jordan about to take possession of the land of Israel. And there's no distinction between religious law and civil law and national law. It's all one big package. And indeed, I would say in the dispersion of 2,000 years, we had to hold on more to that element of religion. That's what bound us. But our origins are as a people, and our dream, integral to our religion throughout, has always been this longing to return to a land. And we've institutionalized that longing, and it's in the Birkat Hamazon, and it's in the Amidah, and it's in breaking a glass at the end of the wedding ceremony, and it's hanging a mizrach, or here it's probably a ma'arab or whatever on your home, and it's praying in the direction of Jerusalem. Integral to our religion was always this longing to return to a land to fulfill ourselves as a people. And that's, I mean, al regel echad, that's what I would say. We never were only a religion. Yeah.
Yeah, but in response to that, if it's in the context of this war and Islam against Judaism, why is it okay in the Quran but not in the Tanakh?
That's a good response too. Yeah, please.
I want to respond for things that you said before, but all the things that you can say about what they're saying about Israel. So they say that we are comparing us to the Nazis, but I think it's quite a little bit hypocrite to compare us to Nazis when they are denying the Holocaust.
Good point. What Nazis exactly? What did they do? I never thought about that. That would sort of. Good point for us to all keep in mind. Thank you. Somebody else had their. Yeah, please.
My apologies to start, as this is slightly more of a comment than a question, but I'm going to ask a question to people here. Could you put up your hand, please, if you are a Zionist, or you consider yourself to be a Zionist?
What do you think, you're an educator?
All right, I'm sorry, it's important. No, so however you define that, please put up your hand if you think you're a Zionist. Keep your hand up if that is connected, don't think this is a trick question at all, just keep your hand up if that is at all connected to your Jewish identity. Okay. My point is, the things you brought up at the start is that I think that there is an obsession with the differentiation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, or attacking Israelis and attacking Jews. And I think that for starters, if we're insisting on Israel being recognized as a Jewish state, and we're all in this room saying that Israel and Zionism is part of our Jewish identity, and let's get over that for a second. Let's stop differentiating and saying, oh, well, it would be okay if they attacked Israelis, but because they said Jewish lobby and not Israel lobby, that's terrible. And I'll tell you why it makes a practical difference. Going on to the Mike Carlton cartoon that you put up, yes, the hooked nose was slightly anti-Semitic, and you can make arguments about that, but what was lost in that was the debate was about whether Mike Carlton is an anti-Semite or not. The debate wasn't about the ideas that he wrote about in his column. Right. And yes, the cartoon was slightly anti-Semitic, but you know what? I am a Jew. My grandfather does have a big nose, and that's a slight joke. But at the same time, when they attack Jews for supporting Israel, we are Jews and we support Israel. So I just think that if we're going to really tackle that issue, we need, or the issue of criticism against Israel, I think that the crying anti-Semitism every 3 seconds is completely unhelpful. And just as something was said over there is an idea that the world is against us, and that everyone is automatically demonizing and hates Israel and is anti-Semites. And yes, there are people like Richard Falk in the United Nations, and of course that exists, and it's terrible. But at the same time, from experience at a university, which is meant to be the center of anti-Israel sentiment, most people, particularly in this country, are very open to listening to what you have to say, and will listen to logic and reason. And the attitude that you're criticizing me as a Jew, not as an Israeli, and that you're an anti-Semite and the whole world's against us is completely unhelpful.
Okay, the two of you want to respond?
Yeah, I think that it is really important to make the differentiation between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. I don't think we put too much emphasis on that, because there are people who are Zionists. Sorry, there are people who are Zionists who aren't Jewish, and there are people who are Jewish who aren't Zionists. And I think, it is one thing to have a political agenda does not necessarily mean that you hate the people. As you know, I don't think it's ever okay to attack someone, regardless of whether it's because they're attacking them because they're Zionist or attacking them because they're Jewish. But I do think if somebody doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist, I don't think that necessarily means they have something against Jews. Here, people might feel that their Zionism is connected to their Judaism, which is their own choice, and people may feel that that is connected does not mean that when somebody attacks you, they're automatically attacking something you feel is connected to that, in my opinion.
Okay, we'll take your comment and then see.
Just bouncing off that, I'd actually like to direct it back to a question to you. Just based off, I guess, this narrative that we have of there is all this unjustifiable criticism out there, and I totally agree that there needs to be some responsibility in the criticism, but at times I feel it becomes almost the sole purpose of Zionists, especially in the diaspora, their mission is almost to take every piece of criticism against Israel and point out the points where this has occurred, and it almost absolves people of dealing with the issues that Israel is responsible for, that we are actually, in this case, we are victims, but we're also the military power in the region, and hold ourselves to this high level of morality that we sometimes don't recognize and try and bring ourselves down to another level. So do you think that this obsession almost with criticism can be detrimental in absolving ourselves from the things that we're actually responsible for dealing with, and the things that Israel is actually, not in the right about, and we don't recognize that because of this obsession?
Okay, so if I would rephrase it, you're suggesting that we kind of have a knee-jerk reaction rather than taking to heart or opening ourselves up to any criticism. Our response is, you're out to get us, and therefore we just have to defend ourselves and so on.
It's more in the sense that a lot of people's first instinct is to go, that's demonization, or that's delegitimization, instead of taking and absolving themselves from perhaps the crux of something that might actually be
right. No, yes, that indeed is one of the messages that I would like to come out of this, that we have, being a sovereign state and being a military power, and having returned onto our land and having said that we want to be able to do that in order to take Jewish values and so on and apply them to the public sphere, puts an incredible responsibility on us. And it might be in responding, depending on the context in which it's offered, we have to respond in a particular way. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to take very seriously our responsibility of sovereignty, which we've been dreaming about for so long. So again, I don't want to get into the specific politics here today, but that responsibility is there. We have to be able to listen, as well as to be able to, if we're going to be able to communicate. It goes along with what you asked before about the ABCs and Ds in terms of the Palestinians. We can't fall into that trap of closing ourselves off to real discussion and real debate if we're in a context in which it's offered. In other words, if it's Israel bashing and demonization and so on, then it's silly to try to do that. But if it's you're suggesting that people are prepared to listen. If you find yourself in that kind of situation, yes, we have to be able to listen. And in some ways, it's easier for people in Israel, and I think that's why the criticism comes out in Israel before it comes out here, because we don't feel threatened. But there is probably, you here in the diaspora have much more of a sense of being embattled than we do in Israel. As I've been saying since I got here, I can't wait to get back to nice, quiet Israel, where I only have to deal with the rockets that are falling, not with not the barrage that you're constantly there. So if that's your point or the question, I do think we have responsibilities that we have to take seriously. All right, we'll take a couple more comments. I do want to get into, I want to ask you what you would have done with Josh Brumberg at the school and tell you what they did do, but we'll take a couple more.
You mentioned earlier, you spoke about listening, that we need to listen. And the question is, listen to what? I was recently doing this whole escalation. I was in Europe, leading a Jewish tour with adults. And it actually became a tour to a large extent of demonstrations. And we went from Paris to Berlin to around Croatia, etc. And every place that we went we landed up confronting demonstrations against Israel. And the voices that we heard, to a large extent, always, without exception, escalated to anti-Jewish as opposed to anti-Israel. So, you know, when one wants to listen to legitimate criticism of Israel, it's all good and well. But unfortunately, the message gets blurred, and it's without exception. In other words, every single demonstration that we attended, or everything that we read about in the local press, etc., all degenerated to blatant anti-Semitism. So unfortunately, you know, when one wants to listen, one needs to try and differentiate between the rhetoric, and it becomes more and more difficult when one tries to sort of separate the anti-Jewish, if one does sort of aspire to this notion that anti-Semitism isn't anti-Zionism and vice versa. If you want to try and separate the two, it becomes more and more difficult when it always degenerates into anti-Semitism.
Well, probably a demonstration is not the best place to have this kind of conversation.
But you know, that's where you hear the voices.
That's where you hear the voices, but it's not where you're going to really hear the voices in a way that you can really listen and engage. I think there are opportunities that you can create, not necessarily on the kind of trip that you had, but in the environments that you are all in, whether it's schools or youth movements and camps and so on, you can engage in that kind of debate. Somebody, where was it now, since I've been in so many cities in the last week, I think it was a group from Melbourne, where they just had an interfaith trip to Israel. They had 4 rabbis, 4 imams, and 4 priests all go off together to Israel, where they did visit sites that were that had meaning to them, and apparently there really was real discussion and real listening. And I would urge you to create, rather than to go into the demonstrations where it's unlikely to really get anywhere, to urge you, I don't know how many of you in your youth movements have tried to set up any kind of dialogue with representatives of the Muslim community. I'm curious, has anybody done that? 1, okay. I hadn't thought of that before, but that would be a fascinating thing to try to do. I just throw that out. It would be interesting to see if these criteria could be applied in that kind of environment. Okay, let me just ask you, what do you think, what should have happened with Josh Brumberg, and what do you think did happen? We could go on for another hour about that, but I don't want to leave that, yeah.
I feel like he should have been like, that should more of a, he should be commended for his actions, like, especially
He should have been what?
Commended for his actions, especially
commended?
Yeah, because I think that in our Jewish community, I can only speak, I don't know the South African Jewish community, but I know in our Jewish community, where we have such a one-sided outlook on Israel is like the dominant view, and for a student of a school to come out against, you know, this mainstream view of Israel that our community like hammers into the youth is like something that is like honorable and like admirable, to show that we're youth, we think differently, we will criticize, and that like I think I'm ashamed of what the South African community has done to him, because I feel like...
What do you think they've done to him?
Well, they pretty much excommunicated him from the community, from what I heard.
There are Facebook pages dedicated to hate on Josh.
And they made a petition like to get rid of him.
Like, it's crazy.
So I think that like us and other diaspora Jews should rally behind him and to promote the idea of critical thought and to promote the idea that it's okay to have a different opinion.
Interesting. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I just think that it's not his fault that he's ended up on the front page, right? So his opinion is his opinion, and that's fine, he has it, and like Stig said, that's really good that he's like able to keep that opinion.
Does it make a difference to either of you that he's the deputy head boy of the school?
Yes.
No. Okay, so...
Look, I completely agree. I agree with you. I think that the youth do somewhat have a responsibility to be critical. It's the best time for you to be critical and sort of express your different views and consider and sort of evaluate all the views that are available to you. But when you're in a position of authority and leadership like that, I think the Jewish community, especially in a time like this, needs to appear as a united front. Ultimately.
But we're not a united front, because like...
Why aren't we?
Because let's get... You'll continue debating it all over lunch. Let's just get another couple of things. I'll make a concluding statement, and you'll be able to eat this over lunch.
I think it's important to know that yes, he does have a different responsibility because in this position of power representing his school, but so it should be considered under different circumstances. But the issue is that it it has been considered that, but the issue is what happened, not that it was considered that he has this responsibility because he's representing his school. Because that, like, that's correct, but what happened is still wrong.
What happened to him?
Like what's happening to him, and I'm pretty sure he was removed of his position.
I'll let you know that what really happened in just a moment. Yeah.
I want to say he was in a position of power at his school, and because he came out and said something free-thinking that wasn't the norm, it's a credit to his education that he's able to think critically and individually. And I also want to point out that the quote that was out there from him before, it said, "I'm not anti-Israel." It wasn't an anti-Israel statement, it was a pro-peace statement, and he's being critical of both sides.
I mean, I think from that situation and a lot of social media and just things that I've heard in this whole discussion, you know, I think as a community, often there's a very hard come down on people very quickly, without thought often, for expressing, you know, concern for the other side. And I think, you know, part of this discussion, you know, I think it's really important that, you know, whatever he did in his position, whether that was the right thing to do, I think that that other people in the community have created Facebook pages to hate him and kill him. I mean, I think that's more disturbing in some ways than what he did.
Okay, another one or two comments, and then I'll let you know what really happened. And
I want to go back to the kids at school. That I had older kids.
The kid, you want to go back to?
The kids at school, that they have a different opinion. And I also had a kid in my class that he said, "I want to say something about Israel, and I'm tired of being brainwashed about this, hearing how Israel is wonderful, how Israel is good," and he was slamming on the desk, and he said, "And the matter of fact, Israel always stopped." And I said, "Okay, so what do you know?" But the problem is, you need to know which knowledge they have before they're saying those statements. Because most of the time, the problem is that they don't have enough knowledge to support what they're saying. So that's.
But that goes on both sides, though.
That's different.
Like, when you,
we'll take one more. Any school administrators here?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
school
it's-
administrator. Let's hear
Not
from
a
the
school
school
administrator,
administrator.
exactly, but as a product of King David, and
Okay.
as having taught there for 12 years.
Okay.
On reading Josh Bromberg's thing, on the one hand I was saying, "Go Josh, you're so articulate, you're amazing for a 17-year-old. When I read the absolute vilification, I was saying, "Have you forgotten he's a 17-year-old boy?" Okay, and I think that there's so many sides to the story, and he is only 17 years old. Okay, and a lot of kids much older than 17 years old do that kind of thing, and do you hold what they do against them forever? And there was a lot of support for him. There were both sides, and I think the Reich letter, you know, kind of put him straight, but who could ever anticipate that kind of mass hysteria? And that's the difference today with social media and that you have to be very careful.
A few very important points there, and I'd love to go on with this conversation. Do you want to stay a few more minutes? I know it's lunchtime, so I won't make you vote on that. But the fact that he's 17 is definitely important. What was the last thing you said? Sorry.
About social media?
About social media, right. We used to be able to say in conversations like this, what we say among ourselves is one thing, what we say outside is another. And you people know a lot better than me that there no longer is any inside and outside. As soon as it's on Facebook, that's it. It belongs to the whole world. And in terms of being 17, and this is a message for everybody, whatever their age is, I am thinking about this. You know, if you go to the Haggadah for Pesach and we have the 4 sons, the difference between the wise son and the wicked son is almost imperceptible. If you weren't aware that you were reading about a wicked son and a wise son and you didn't know all the commentaries, you would read the 2 statements and say, what's the difference? He's saying, what does this mean to you? And the other one is saying, why are we doing these things? And you don't make that kind of distinction. And I think all of us, in whatever positions we're in the community, have to really be very careful before deciding whether somebody's wicked or wise, and that also applies to the thing about being 17. I'm concerned about going over time, and I do want to share with you what the Board of Jewish Education did do. This is from a letter that they issued after having an emergency meeting last Tuesday night. I think it was. We have a long-established heritage of encouraging debate, freedom of thought and expression. We are proud of this ethos. That's what you grew out of. And the framework it has created for young people to grow and learn from their mistakes as much as their successes. The South African Board of Jewish Education does not support censorship. Rather, we encourage our students to participate amongst the diverse voices that make up the South African Jewish community. We would also like to emphasize that some of the commentary on this issue on various social media has been inappropriately hurtful and vitriolic, a very strong word, which is against the ethos and values of the school. So rather than what you thought you heard that they had done, in fact, it's very different. It is it's our responsibility to educate and nurture young minds in an environment which is safe, yet where students are held accountable. We also understand our task as a school to find ways to turn these kinds of experiences into learning opportunities and to work to ensure unity in our school and the broader community, despite the inevitability of divergent views. This statement is endorsed by their executive and brings the matter to a close with no further action to be taken. So unlike rumors of what they had done, the board, I think, took an extremely moderate view where they held the values of freedom of speech and expression and the unity of the community above the concern that they might have had with the contents of what was issued. It was a decision that was very surprising. I was there in the midst of all of this when it was happening. It was a position that was very surprising to many members in the community that expected at least for Josh to be reprimanded and so on. I don't hate to put Josh on trial here when he's not around, and of course he's only a case study. But I think for all of us, the message should be, and they said it, we do not support censorship. The fact that they don't support censorship and the fact that we have the right for freedom of expression doesn't mean that we ourselves shouldn't demonstrate restraint, and that all of us have to weigh our words very carefully, realizing the implications of them, with whom they're likely to reach, what the understandings or misunderstandings or interpretations of them are going to be. That doesn't mean we shouldn't say what we feel or believe, but we should say it carefully and measured and really take that into consideration. And I think, again, we have the 4 sons. Nobody wants to get rid of any of them. We want to, it's very important, particularly at these times, I think, for us to remain united as a community. And I think in dialogue and in discourse with one another, we really have to struggle now, as you know, in times of crisis, even more than other times, to really find those things that unify us and allow us to have the kind of conversations that we need to have. So I'd love to go on with you, but I'm sure you're all starving after that tea. You all want lunch, and we'll end it here.